Hello viewers, you ready for another reaction video? Yes. I didn't want to go back to these two, but I have to do what my viewers ask, and then few of them have been saying, Andy, did you see what they said about ELP? You need to react to it. What would you think? So I've just had another one through and I thought, shall we just do it? I'm ready to go. A few years ago, I decided to do the 20 greatest progressive rock bands of all time. It was a two-episode thing. And when I got to number 2 and I was going through it, I realised I'd missed ELP off. Now, the reason I missed ELP off is because I didn't like ELP and I was, subconsciously ignoring them. Like the little old lady in the Lady Killers, and how, she keeps forgetting her umbrella all the time. And then she looks at it and goes, perhaps I don't like this, and I'd forgot ELP. And this, I felt bad about this because I knew they should be on the list even if I don't like them. So I went back to them and started to listen to them. And what surprised me, with all the knowledge I'd got doing this channel and exploring the English aesthetic and the use of sort of parody and comedy, and it was the comedy aspect I didn't like. And then when I realised that was an essential thing and I started to listen to it again and started to realise the genius of those three musicians, I have changed my opinion. And you could do that, You can do that. Have I got something on here? Oh no, it's the little leaping thing, isn't it? To show the quality. So these two did this the other day. I reacted to it, but it's so long that I only got through the first 2 hours. At the end, they react to. Let's get my computer over here so I can start and stop it a bit easier. Right. Let's put it there. So I've got the start and stop. Shall we see what they say about Trilogy by ELP, which is when I rank the album, I put the first album at number 1 because I think they just landed so perfect on that first album. It's all there. But my favourite album, and arguably perhaps their best album, is Trilogy, that did come out in 1972 in the year of prog. I'm sure these guys knowing about progressive rock are going to absolutely love this album, aren't they? So I should be in full agreement, he said knowingly, that that's not the case.
The only other album I think we should probably mention, because after all it is by one of the bands that are seen as being, one of the forerunners, the preeminent progressive rock bands, ELP's Trilogy. Mm-hmm. It's got some great tracks on it, hasn't it? I like the title track very much.
Oh, I think the title track is fantastic. Yeah. Well, I think the thing is with Trilogy, I think with ELP, full stop, it wasn't just with Works or the brilliant Love Beach. They never really made a completely good album. I think the debut is perhaps as close as you get to something that is consistently strong, because they look...
I agree. That's true. Like I said, when you step back and you listen to them objectively, as I did when I did my ranking, I thought the first album was the best album. And some of the extravagance which they get criticised for isn't as apparent on there. And it's got a dark aesthetic that is wonderful. But this idea that there's bad stuff on Trilogy or Brain Salad Surgery is questionable. Tarkus, side 1 of Tarkus is equally brilliant. Side 2 is good, but it is not the same. Let's see. I think what we're going to have here is the standard narrative that there's something bad about progressive rock, but really it's embodied by ELP, and what it is in pretentiousness, overindulgence, a sort of knowing virtuosity rammed down your throat, which is at the expense of creativity and expression, blah blah blah. That's what we're going to get. We're going to basically get the post-punk narrative of ELP, in that they embody something terrible. Now, you know straight away that Tim, he always likes the more proggier stuff than Stephen. Stephen always has to show that he's a bit of an 80s child, a bit of a post-punk indie guy. He's going to come like that, whereas Tim, being a bit older, is I think has had a close experience of experiencing these bands at the time and realising what they're like. But again, he has said the contrarian thing, that Love Beach is a lot better than everybody thinks. And he's right there. So up until now, I agree, except I want to know what the bad tracks are on Trilogy, and I'm going to predict it. It'll be things like The Sheriff. It'll be the comedy things, the lighter ones they won't like. I didn't like them and now I've learnt to realise that without that, because there's nothing really funny on the first album. This is what we're going to get, I predict.
They'd always have a little classical piece. They'd always have something where they were just showing off their chops.
There we go.
And so for me, the great ELP albums, and Tarkus and this I'd include, and certainly Brainside of Surgery, some astonishing music. As players, they're all wonderful, especially for me. Emerson.
Yes.
So yeah, I think they never really made a completely strong album, but certainly in their run of classic
Tell us the
albums
tracks.
with some brilliant progressive material that you can hear influencing bands both in Britain and on the continent. As we're going to come on to sort of especially Italian bands, where I think ELP and Van de Graaff were perhaps the two strongest influences.
Agree, that's true.
So yeah, the title track, certainly, I think it's The Endless Enigma. I think there's some really good stuff on this.
Yeah, that's the other good track. I think ELP haven't dated that great for me. It does sound one of the accusations that people that don't like progressive rock will constantly throw at it is that it was self-indulgent.
Yeah. Musicians
playing 10-minute long Moog solos. That's ELP, isn't it? That's ELP, and the sort of the classical pretensions as well. I always have an issue with
pretentious
classical pretensions.
But where I say ELP go against it on two fronts really of the attacks that people have on progressive rock, unfair attacks. Number one, there was a lot of humour in ELP. I don't particularly like the humour. The humour is one of the elements I don't like in ELP, but there was a lot of very juvenile humour in ELP, so they weren't always taking themselves seriously. And number two, I think they had a real sense of rock and roll showmanship. That actually
Tim's
really was.
Tim's right.
Roxy had to a certain extent.
If Tim knows that, that's exactly the same thing I thought. When I went back to them, I thought they have this rock and roll showmanship. They have the sort of Jimi Hendrix things on the keyboards, and they will do rock and roll covers like Led Zeppelin do. They show the visceral side of them, like you get picture of an exhibition, but it's balanced. It's balanced naturally by Nut Rocker. The sublime is created in the juxtaposition of those two things, and all the seriousness and pretentiousness, the prick that bursts that bubble is things like Benny the Bouncer, right? The comedy is essential. Without this, they would be a big pompous prog band. So if you could identify that and recognize that, what is it in us that can't take that prick? If you know what I'm saying. So could it be that we have a pomposity and pretentiousness that cannot quite deal with the more anarchic, troublesome aspects of ELP?
Entertainers, they were still drawing on kind of rock and roll or ragtime or roots music with enthusiasm. And I think that slightly negates the classical pretensions.
Yes, it does. So why does that not make it better?
Okay, but I certainly see the classical pretensions, and I have no particular axe to grind.
Yeah.
When you get to albums like Works, particularly with a side taken up by Keith Emerson's symphony or whatever, or concerto, or whatever it was, to me, and Pirates is one of the worst pieces of music I've ever heard in my life. The Gilbert.
I'm not very fond of Pirates.
So I think they get a lot more. They go a lot more down that road later.
But I think the one thing that people
isn't there a sort of
right. So Stephen's argument is, even though you're correct, I find the idea of musicians like Keith Emerson making classical music offensive, and so offensive it still trumps the fact that they might have balanced it with this stuff, right? Why can rock musicians not bring in classical elements? Why can they not create a concerto? Is it not the case that the thing that destroyed classical music or orchestral music was their inability to cope with rock and roll? The inability to, with all the avant-garde expression that modern classical composers were bringing in, that they were unable to take on board drums, electric guitar, improvisation, feedback, noise, synthesis, vocals, all these things that that had emerged in the late part of the 20th century were ignored by classical musicians. And so really, why can't Keith Emerson, who is an incredibly talented player, write a piece of music for orchestra and rock band, or write a piece of music for which it would be Pirates, or write as a pianist a piece for him playing piano, drawing on the showmanship and exuberance of his post Jimi Hendrix style. I think what we've got here, I'm afraid, is good old classism. It's the idea that these people shouldn't be doing this, and if they do it, it's pretentious because they should be rock musicians, and rock musicians should only channel a bunch of very simplistic narratives about visceralness and expression. In other words, it's this idea, and I don't think Stephen's like this, because I think there's actually in him there is a struggle between these two things, because he loves progressive rock, but being the same age as me and coming up through the critical discourse that was going on in the 1980s, he has taken on this idea, I think, that you have to listen to music from the standpoint of being the sophisticated listener, identifying the raw, visceral brilliance of the Ramones, because you are clever. The Ramones aren't. They are. It's a real expression. It's like it's about being authentic and truthful, and they believe that truth is embodied in the simpleton. It's like the noble savage. It's the Rousseau idea that there is more worth to someone expressing themselves without ability and knowledge or culture or skill than there is when they have it. I believe that both of those are things, and I think we need a world where ELP do this, which is why it sold millions of records, why they filled stadiums, and why every bit of money that they earned, they went put back into the show to try and create something that really is a one-off and should be valued in the cultural history of mankind, because there is only a certain set of situations financially, creatively, in a certain period of time where you can have a rock band in a stadium with a full orchestra, where the guy goes from playing some rock and roll pastiche or whatever it is that they've just done to then walking over to the piano and playing his own composition that he wrote to exist in this situation. All the things that make that happen are so ridiculous that it shows you that human beings and the project of being human, the project of existing on this earth, is unique, it's profound, and it's sublime. It's just what narrative you want to apply for this. And what we're getting here is this sort of almost like outdated postmodernist take on rock music, which I think this is the thing that is like that, not ELP. Sorry, because everyone's been saying, Andy, you need to go and react to it, and so I've had to react to it. And I know, team, I don't know Stephen. I met him a couple of times. He probably can't remember, but I don't agree. But he's got a perfect right to his opinion. I've got a perfect right to my opinion, and you've got a perfect right to say which one you think is correct. Of course, the answer to this will be, well, anyway, it's just if you think it's good or not good, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. That is the most postmodern concept going, and it contradicts the idea that the only good stuff is stuff created in an authentic way. The author was destroyed by Roland Barthes, right? He questioned the validity of the author. The many of the postmodernists would probably see more value in what Keith Emerson and Carl Palmer and Greg Lake were doing in their crass pastiches of classical music. Surely this is the greatest, working class English description of culture, and to try and recreate in a rock band format the equivalent of a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, right, is a work of genius, whether you like it or not.
Album as well.
There is. I don't mind it. I actually quite like it. There's definitely Aaron Copland influences on this album. But one of the things I sort of like about ELP is they seem to be enjoying themselves. There's kind
Tim
of
likes it
chaotic
really.
energy about
Tim likes it really.
Sure. And I definitely think they're a first division band when they're firing all cylinders, like on the title track here, or parts of the first album particularly, and definitely parts of Brain Cell Surgery. You think this is a band, and parts of Tarkus as well. They're right up there.
Absolutely.
Close
but
to the
the weird thing is that they didn't seem to sustain this for 40 minutes or 35 minutes. This was a band that did.
I wish they named the tracks that are the weakest.
I think they were quite. Reading between the lines, it feels like they were a little bit too dysfunctional as a band, personality wise, to actually achieve what bands like Yes achieve, and Crimson notoriously all falling out with Robert all the time anyway. But maybe Crimson's not a good example. But a band like Yes, for example, they seem to all be somehow finding a way to all move in the same direction all the time for the betterment of the whole, this kind of gestalt thing.
And I think you're right, because that comes in, I think, with Genesis as well, who lived together at one point.
An aside, which is I could just add to this, is that once the bands have got that success, and when you've got sort of such musically creative, talented people in bands, which these bands are the case. We're not talking about Glenn Matlock or Patti Smith or whatever it is. These are really brilliant musicians, and so they will have their own vision. And Yes and ELP tried two different techniques to deal with this, which I think were very intelligent techniques. In Yes's case, they took a break and they all went off and made their solo albums of all varying degrees. But I think in terms of Elias's son Hilo, I think in terms of Rick Wakeman's solo albums, and especially Chris Squire's album, and to some extent Steve Howe Beginnings, those albums, I mean, Ramshackle by Alan Moore, that's a bit strange, but those albums almost become an extension of the Yes catalogue. They're like essential purchases. Anyone who's a Yes fan has to have Fish Out of Water, by Chris Squire. It's essential. And then when they came back, thank God, they managed to pull off Going for the One, which is such a masterpiece that it allowed them to keep going. ELP didn't choose that. What they decided to do was stay together as a band and do their solo projects together. So after Brain Salad Surgery and then the big Triple Live album, Welcome Back My Friends to the Show That Never Ends, they then go off to do their own projects, and it's patchy. That's the problem when it's all together. I think if there was some weird album that had come out in 1977, which was Keith Emerson's piano concerto for orchestra that he'd funded himself and had sold a few copies, we may be going, it's really interesting, Keith Emerson, we would be talking about it in a different way. I think that project failed, and they lost momentum, and they decided to put it out over 2 albums, Works. Now, I've gone back to Works, and they're way better than everybody thinks. It's eclectic and different, but they're exploring all sorts of different ideas. And as Tim has rightly said, a different album cover on Love Beach, put the epic up front, change some of the dodgy lyrics that Greg Lake was singing, and you've got an album which could have been very strong. Not a Going for the One, but definitely better than Tomato.
And this is why when I said about those 2 albums, particularly that every single member of Genesis and Yes 1972 is firing all cylinders. Yeah. They're all brilliant. They're all contributing.
So's ELP.
And they're pushing each other along, whereas you feel that maybe with ELP, there was a lot of competitiveness that could have been negative.
I think it's competitive, and it's also, now I want my 10-minute solo.
Yeah.
You're having your 10-minute solo, I'm going to have my 10-minute solo. And by the way, I'm going to have a sort of Persian rug on stage now.
I mean, these are all the cliches they're trotting out. The truth is that when ELP came out and played at the California Jam with Deep Purple and all those other bands, they were playing to like hundreds of thousands of people. They were a massive stadium act. And the reason people were coming in was not because they'd written a bunch of pop songs or they had some riffs like Smoke on the Water. The reason people were turning up to those gigs was to experience this outlandish band on stage, which had a whole bunch of stuff. Now, I think they've contradicted themselves a little bit here, because I think this idea that Keith Emerson emerges in the late 60s, in the 90s, and he's playing this classical music, but he's got a Hammond organ and he's stabbing it with knives and he's twisting it out. And if you see them doing that, and they do it on the Isle of Wight, another huge festival, by the time they get to California Jam, what you've got is a show. And if people turn up, they expect to see, on top of all the incredible music, Keith Emerson do that. They expect to have Carl Palmer playing some huge drum kit that you can't pick up because it's made out of metal, right? And he's got his shirt off, right? And he has got a chain in his teeth and he's ringing a bell. If I say that to you, that he used to have a chain connected to a belt and he used to pull it and do a big drum set like that, right? Anybody who hasn't seen that will then go, well, I've got to go and have a look at that, right? And Greg Lake, his solo spots were to bring in another aspects, and they were his very introvert, delicate, beautiful acoustic songs. I mean, if he had just done that, they would all be, kissed his bottom like they do with Van Morrison and all that lot, and so he's on a Persian rug. He's sat on a Persian rug. This criticism, it's just right. There's these two criticisms of ELP. One is the Persian rug, and the other one is that they had, juggernauts with their names written on the top that nobody could read unless you've got a helicopter. But the fact was, they did have a helicopter, and they could show you it and fly and film it. So we have all seen it. And if people do not understand that is the show, welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. This is P.T. Barnum, right? This is music for the common man. It's all there. If you step back and you look at the project, this is popularism, and the middle classes don't like it. They like their sophisticated music sophisticated, and then they like to look down on the proles, and they like to appreciate their punk rock and their hip hop and the fact that they're there, because it probably makes them feel better in their elevated position to see where they stand. And they don't like this. ELP are working class guys, but they're intelligent and they're creative. And this idea that bands have a tension and they fight each other, right? That is a band. Yes, had it. King Crimson had it. Led Zeppelin had it. These things were always going on. If you look at Led Zeppelin, it's supposed to be one of the most cohesive bands, right? John Paul Jones left in 1974 and they had to woo him back in. The reason why the new tracks on Physical Graffiti are drums and guitar led is because he wasn't there. He had left. He'd had enough. Right? If you look at your history, that is an essential quality. But the idea that there was some sort of ego thing going on, and the idea that is why they were doing the solos, what would have happened if they come out and not done those solos? Yeah, pretty much destroyed them.
Yeah, suspended off the ceiling. This showmanship and this kind of wanting to outdo, and I hear it in the music, and it's not just about the presentation. I hear that sensibility.
Yeah, and
because you should. There's nothing wrong with it. What's wrong with showmanship?
At one point had this.
What's wrong with showmanship? What's wrong with popularism? What's wrong with pleasing the great mass of unwashed people?
And Ringo Starr was always really interesting, regardless of what people say about him. And I think that's it. That with Yes and Genesis, you kind of feel that they're really pushing one another along, and they're absolutely lost in this explosion of sound. Whereas with ELP, you kind of sense that Lake and Emerson Palmer, they're looking at each other with disgust during certain moments.
I think there's also, I don't want to be insecure, it feels like we're roasting ELP here, but
don't.
Because I do think they're an incredible band, they were an extraordinary band, but I think the other thing is that I'm slightly suspicious that there's an inherent lack of taste there. Look at the cover artwork. Tarkus is one of the worst covers I've ever seen.
I think there we have it, really. Right, he's suspicious in his viewpoint that there's a lack of taste. And I'm a middle class boy. My dad was a director of a company. I know exactly what it's like to be that nerdy, quiet, introverted, middle class boy in the 1980s, trying to make a sense of the world and being drawn towards progressive rock because it pushes all these buttons, which are essentially quite immature. Bands like ELP and Rush are immature, right? But immaturity is an essential quality of rock and roll. And that's why ELP have to have it. A band like Henry Cow, which is much closer to a 70s band employing modern classical techniques in music, from their sort of Marxist perspective, having a position which is questioning that. So they have their anti-establishment wound in that the punks have. That would be much more appreciable to someone who, from a sophisticated critical point of view. But Henry Cow were never going to fill stadiums like ELP, and it's something you have to take on board. And I think, you know, in a 500 years, when people look back on us now, this would seem like a foible, right? And I think here, I feel that the ELP album covers are absolutely iconic. I think they kick it out the park. Trilogy is a bit dodgy, though, I do admit, but this is fantastic. I love it. You know, it's like if you're 14 years old and you've got is it an armadillo which is actually armored and it can kill you, and it's a terrible beast that looks like a rat that's going to hurt you, right? Painted in this sort of naive way, like almost like the sort of thing that this is what rock and roll is. And anybody who steps back and looks at rock and roll, that looks at ACDC or looks at Chuck Berry or looks at any of these, they are all as ridiculous, because this is the music of youth. You know, if you want to listen to something serious at our age, then go and listen to Bach, you know, because that is what that is. That's grown-up music. I don't listen to Bach. I'd rather listen to ACDC or ELP.
Cover to Thick as a Brick. Or the cover to Close to the Edge.
Yeah.
Great, era-defining, unforgettable cover.
I think there's
now
maybe,
look at the cover to Trilogy.
Yeah, but maybe there's a greater sense of ego in ELP, and that's what made them great, and it's also what perhaps worked against them.
Yeah.
And I do think you're right. I mean, taste is an interesting thing, because sometimes
Come on,
I
Tim.
really like it when bands go down that rabbit hole of bad taste.
Yes.
Sometimes we don't have enough of it, because there's some music being produced. You know, we said this before, that, you know, I've loved the ECM label, I've loved albums on this, but sometimes I'm overwhelmed by good taste of making the right sound.
Tim
is
is stepping very carefully here through this.
Bands actually just think,
but he's right.
You know what, bugger it.
Do you like the cover to Love Beach?
Yes.
I think it's an atrocity. And in a way, I love it because of that.
What would you rather have on your wall, the cover to Love Beach or the cover to Tarkus?
I'd probably go for Tarkus.
Really? I'd rather have Love Beach, because at least it's funny.
Because that basically is the expression of the postmodern. And this is something that I think is very apparent here, is that our age group have an aesthetic view which comes from postmodernism. The idea of Roland Barthes, of the death of the author, and the idea that there is something of value in the kitsch that we can, from our sophisticated point of view, appreciate. It's the same elevated position that thinks that punk's great, even though they didn't really know what they're doing. It is what has always been. I have a degree in art, and I became very aware of this, that within the arts there is this idea of high culture and low culture, and these are used as badges of class. And what we have now is a sort of educated elite, educated upper middle class elite, that went to university, and they believe that by wearing their identitarian Marxist sort of view of the world, which is a perfectly valid view, but by having that, it signals actually their position of sophistication. It is the new badge of sophistication. And the appreciation of the kitsch, all of that is embodied in my generation's values, which have now atrophied into what the very thing that these bands were trying to react against. This is a really profound point that goes beyond simply having a top 10 albums or reacting in that way. In 1917, when Marcel Duchamp put that urinal into that exhibition, the reason why he did it was because he knew that the educated elite would be so bamboozled by that idea that they would spend the rest of time chasing their tails, asking what is art, while common people could get on with actually making art. And the art they made was completely different. It was film, it was pop music, dance music, and now it's computer games and TikTok videos and YouTubes, right? And still, that will never go away. Whilst all the normal people are watching all the stuff that they love and getting great value from it, the rarefied upper classes will go around the circle and they will sip, champagne at various art galleries, staring at somebody who has just basically done what Marcel Duchamp did over 100 years ago. Marcel Duchamp was the best, greatest artist of the 20th century because he destroyed art. He took it and he knew the way to ram it back up its own arse. And that is something that we have, and that is what we've got going on here. And I think in the future, when people look back at this period, this will be seen as a sort of bourgeoisie attitude that we recognize when we go back to certain cultures. Why people wore great big white wigs and put black spots and all that type of stuff. It'll be seen as an affectation of worthiness. And I think going forward, what we are doing here on these YouTube videos is celebrating as middle-aged to old men how much we love the exuberance, but by the same token here, being very knowledgeable that we are above that exuberance now because we've grown up and sophisticated. And I think Tim is right in saying sometimes you just have to switch that off and not go back to this with a postmodernist thing and say, well, I know it's rubbish, but I'm so sophisticated, I can appreciate something wonderful. We have to actually embrace what it represents and realise that ELP on those albums embodied something that we have lost in the arts, because the ideas that came in with punk and the postmodernist philosophy that followed in from that has now atrophied, and it's that needs a bomb putting up it, not the idea that ELP were a bunch of just normal guys that happened to be highly skilled and virtuoso that came in and just shat all over culture in every shape or form, and just turned what was actually very deep, interesting, exciting music into a form that normal people could like, which is an incredible achievement. And this has only made me realise that ELP are unbelievable.
Love Beach, obviously. I mean, I've always said about Love Beach that actually, if you put the sidelong epic on the first side...
I just said you'd say that. We're done. Go away. Well done, chaps. Very good. I'm going to get in trouble now. Do you know that? Oh, are you still there? I'm going to get in trouble now. Because I know Tim and Stephen Wilson, they'll watch it. And they'll go, I don't like that Andy anymore. They'll get all annoyed because they think I'm insulting. But I can't help it. I have got a degree in art. I have got that brain that goes and rips the whole thing apart. Because that's what art does. Right? And I've had it done to me and I love it. I love it. It's like, this is how we move forward. But I think they're wrong. And I think Tim is that Stephen that's wrong on this. He's wrong on this. And when he stops this and he goes back to making proper progressive rock albums that are just bad taste and cheesy like ELP, if he does that, he will have a million seller. I'm telling you that, Stephen, now. That's what I believe. The whole prog will go, finally, I like the Raven, but it was too dark and mournful. What I want is Stephen Wilson just delivering full-on prog as only he can. And how do you find the thing within this cheap, unsophisticated thing that progressive rock has that we hate, right? How do you take that, which is who we are, and put that forward? And this really asks a fundamental question, which I think is the big one, is in a post-punk, post-rock and roll era, in a postmodern, post-postmodernism, or a, what you could call it a meta-modernist era. Is it the case that we have to let go that the only thing that's creatively valid is made by musicians that are just out of their teens? Because that has never existed before. And I think Steven Wilson is in the best position to actually explore that. And the way he would have to do it is by embracing bad taste. So as much as I may have slated this opinion, I hope I have offered something that is well worth thinking about, because this applies to all of us old, grey-haired, creative people. Although I'm very impressed in Steven Wilson's hair. He hasn't got a one dash of grey. Oh, come on, Andy. You can't now do that to him. I really love Steven Wilson. I think his work is great. His last album I reviewed, and I really explored the profundity of what he was doing in that album. But I think this postmodernist, knowing, sophisticated aesthetic needs to be gone. It's redundant, and it is just the sound or the embodiment of a sophisticated, educated elite. It is basically the aesthetic version of virtue signalling. I think they're done. If you like this video, like it. If you want some more, come and subscribe. If you're Steven Wilson, just switch it off and never talk to me ever again. And if you meet me, just look at me with a glower and I will know why, and I will look down and you can go, oh, I don't like that Andy Edwards. I don't like him. I don't like him. Who the hell is he? Some little pumped up prog drummer. Used to be in IQ. Bloody IQ. What the hell's that? And now what he's doing, he's just bitter. He's bitter, he is, just because he's attempted a progressive rock career and he hasn't had the career I've had, so he's had to end up just doing YouTube videos in his bedroom. Who the hell does he think he is? I'll have him, I will. You watch this. I'll do the album years, and we'll do Andy Edwards' album years, and we'll slate him and give him a kick up the arse. See how he likes it. It's only my opinion. I've got to react, haven't I? I can't just react and not react. I've got to react, I shouldn't have done it. You shouldn't have done it, Andy. You're going to get in trouble here. This is worse than having a go at Pete Pardo. Bloody hell. Why do I have to be such a contrarian? It's the curse of my life. Why do I have to open my mouth and say what I think? It would be so much better if I didn't do that. Why do I have to do it for? I've asked myself over and over again. I'm deep down, I'm quite an introverted and quiet person. I put on an act when I come on here, but I cannot not do it. It's like my daughter, she's the same. I can remember once, and I'll leave you with this story, because it embodies everything that's going on here for me. When my daughter was very little, she wet herself at school. And the teacher pulled me in and said, oh, your daughter's wet herself today. Oh, God. Shall I tell this story? Oh, I'm not going to give it. Shall I even put this video up? I'm just doing it again. Now, I'm going to tell the story now, if you want to know. And so the teacher comes in and said, and my daughter says, yeah, because I put my hand up and asked you if I could go to the toilet, and you said no. And the teacher went, no, you didn't. You didn't put your hand up. If you'd put your hand up, I'd have let you go. And my daughter went, no, I did put my hand up and you wouldn't let me go. And she goes, I did, if I'd have seen that, but you never did. And she just turned around and looked her in the eye and went, you lie. Authority. Bastards.